Okay, so maybe I'm a few months behind on talking about this, but literally being the game I've probably beaten the most times and owned on every single system I've had since the OG GameCube version, including even trying to futilely install it on a Mac a few years back. Yeah, that didn't go very well. It's probably a bit of an understatement to say that I love this game, and I definitely love the remake as well. And one of the best aspects of both the remake and the original, despite all of its campy story elements and intentional cheesiness.
If you don't need me, then get off my back, old man.
Did you say old man, Mr. Kennedy?
You know, one guy being sent to save the president's daughter, who only finally in the remake understood Spanish.
Busco a policía. Vino aquí?
All that crazy stuff is just how good the premise manages to be in spite of all that. Zombies are interesting from the other games, sure, but what about a death cult with a particularly grotesque method of spreading itself? And truly speaking, from a personal perspective, as somebody who grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household who was homeschooled as a kid, yeah, think Jesus camp, and that was pretty much my entire childhood, political stuff, all that. The religious themes in this game definitely struck a huge chord with me. Full disclaimer, I'm not at all into that stuff anymore. But one philosophical question has stuck with me throughout that entire time. Can you at the end of the day truly call the Los Illuminados, which quite literally involves parasites that turn their faithful into mindless drones, a true religious cult? I mean, can you say they're making a conscious decision to believe something when their minds are taken hostage? These cultists quite literally spend their entire days journeying around actual castles and villages, mindlessly and constantly uttering the name of Lord Sadler.
Lord Sadler.
Saying the word brains in Spanish ad nauseum.
Cerebro, cerebro, cerebros.
And are even fully controlled psychically. I mean, that's essentially the whole plot of the game. What you're trying to do is save the president's daughter before the parasite takes over and she can be forced into infiltrating the US government from within. Also, yourself as well. And so, in short, what I'm asking is, without choice or free will, a fundamental aspect of religion as I've always known it to be, are the Los Illuminados valid enough to even meet basic cult requirements? So that is the stupidly complex video game storyline topic I've decided to explore with my free time in this video. I'm Jason from Screen On Point, and I'm asking, are the Los Illuminados from Resident Evil 4 even a valid religion? Okay, to even start down this journey, I think we have to ask ourselves a foundational and fundamental question. What is religion? I know that sounds super simple, but it's really not. We all intuit what it means, and you probably have your own definition of it that goes along with your own beliefs or lack of beliefs. But even when you try to use the dictionary definition, belief in God or gods, that really only applies to theistic religions. There are plenty that are not. I mean, think about Buddhism, Jainism. They don't actually worship a god or a deity, and they are far from alone in doing this. That's a whole category of religion itself. And to go further, for me, growing up in churches, a ton of people would just say they don't believe in religion at all. It's all about relationships with God. So yeah, it gets pretty muddy. So we'll look into some philosophical definitions on this, academic ones that are a little bit more accepted, and we'll get into that in a bit. So with that being said, I think it's important that we first go through the history of the Los Illuminados and do our best to ascertain how it came to be, and then check those principles against those philosophical definitions. So let's start with the rank and file, its lowest level members, the ganados, which literally means cattle in Spanish. Yeah, so this is going to sound pretty disrespectful and demeaning, but it's really no different than the shepherd-sheep analogy people are used to hearing with the world's major religions, and considering sheep is literally a type of cattle, the language really doesn't sound as bad as it might seem on the outset. Etymology of their name aside, how did these villagers end up joining in the first place, especially if this is supposedly against their free will? Well, you could just say they were forced to take it. I mean, they're not going to win in a battle, but aside from that being a potentially violent option where the villagers would definitely lose and probably try to go to war and lose a lot of good people that the Los Illuminados want, especially this early on when they basically have no one a part of their cult, the diplomatic approach is much smarter. And sure enough, the game has a far more compelling story than a simple brute force conversion. If we look into the lore around how they were brought into the cult, we come across some fascinating details. And there's some great resources directly on this topic from Capcom, namely from their short book called Incubate that came alongside provide an official DVD release recounting the story of the original game and some of the new notes that expanded the lore in the remake. It actually expanded it a lot. Both provide a particularly interesting set of circumstances that led to the village's downfall. In the prequel book, it speaks of a small village and its humble and happy conditions prior to the Los Illuminados. They lived a fairly typical agrarian lifestyle based around yearly harvest festivals where they would celebrate everything and enjoy each other's company. There's even a bit about a, quote, paganistic cult that had been suppressed for generations by the Salazar kingdom, and to go further into that, the remake has some insightful notes about the village's story and how they ended up getting this plague in the first place. A foreman who noted his experience being hired to help excavate underneath the castle for these unknown materials stated that it was a well-paying job, but he started to notice something a bit eerie going on and possibly even sinister. There's something going on here that they're not telling us, because many workplace incidents started to occur with people abruptly passing out and catching a strange cough. Could it be the spores from the strange amber that they were mining? What was inside that amber anyway? The foreman noted that he started seeing those symptoms happening to himself as well, to the point that he ended up coughing up blood 3 times in a single day, until suddenly he began to hear a voice in his head. And it was then that he would descend into what the villagers were then referring to as the madness. These villagers were becoming extremely violent, uncontrollable, and it was clear as day something in them was irreversibly lost. There are further notes from the game that also show how Batoris Mendez, the village chief and Catholic priest, had witnessed what was happening firsthand and recounts his attempts to control it. A man who we now know to be Luis Serra's grandfather had come to him after he had fired his gun at an attacking wolf that somehow withstood a shot, quote, clean through the wolf's head. Knowing the madness was spreading, he knew this was happening to him and said to Mendez that he would simply know what to do. In the notes it says that Mendez looked back at him and just nodded in response. So then it skips ahead to the inevitable. Chief Mendez locked Luis's grandfather inside that cabin and burned him and the cabin to the ground as a means of eradicating and quarantining the spread of this mysterious madness. So going back to the prequel book, it details that one day he called a town meeting to the then still Catholic church where Sadler spoke to the congregation. Intriguingly, it shows that he was a very effective and charismatic orator. Definitely a necessary trait for somebody growing a cult to have in a leader, but he didn't just have a typical sermon. The book details how he spoke for hours and hours, captivating the villagers and relating to them the suppression of his family through what he was referring to as religious persecution by the Salazar kingdom, and that there were some necessary truths to be learned from their way of life, namely the cleansing of souls, and one more very important thing. This is very interesting because the book also mentions how the villagers had known about these pagan belief cults and to stay away from them, and that it was a story which had been passed down through the generations, that the Salazar kingdom had been saved from this cult, and that they were banished for centuries. But 2 key things were happening at the same time of this sermon. The current ruler of the land, Ramon Salazar, also spoke to the village and endorsed these views. He acknowledged that his family did wrongly persecute the Sadlers and their followers. This was a pretty big deal. In the most practical sense, that big element that he had said to them, Lord Sadler promised the Los Illuminados would protect them. From what? Well, the mysterious madness that was wreaking havoc on their village. The man whose account of this happening that was used in the prequel book exclaimed how well these words were received by the congregation, saying, quote, such a generous deed, such a wonderfully generous deed. Sadler had them convinced. And yes, even though they knew to be distrustful historically, the village was going through a legitimate crisis. And of course, it was presented in a much better light than the actual reality of the situation. Sadler didn't just say, alright, so are you guys cool with me injecting a parasite into your blood now? It was clearly presented as a cure for this rapidly spreading madness. Take this injection, it'll save everyone you know, basically. So they accepted this in desperation. This is a really clever deception from Lord Sadler. I mean, he was definitely the cause of the madness in the first place. It's literally the same thing, those spores from the excavations being the initial spread. And again, going back to the prequel book, Sadler further presented the townsfolk with a common refrain that I'm sure you'll recognize.
You will receive our most sacred body.
And I gotta say, that's a really well-disguised way of phrasing it to a Catholic congregation. As somebody who is raised Catholic on my dad's side, the more Jesus Camp stuff was on my mom's side if you're interested, but the phrasing is similar to what it sounds like with how communion would be presented in a Catholic sense. The wafer and wine you receive in Mass are referred to as the actual body and blood of Christ. Yes, the belief is that once it's blessed by the priest, God literally transforms it into Jesus' body and blood. The name for it is Transubstantiation, and it's written all over the Catholic Church, including in the Catechism, which is essentially what the Catholic Church uses as a handbook for its members in properly practicing their faith that comes straight from the Vatican. And as a result, many people actually in real life believe miracles have occurred to demonstrate this.
The transformation of true flesh and true blood being made manifest on that consecrated host. You can see all the scientific studies that have been done on this, and they have found true flesh and true blood type AB, and it's absolutely amazing to see some of the science that's been looked at on this.
Father Andrzej Ziąbra is a witness to the miracle inside the Church of St. Hyacinth. The Szczecin University's Department of Histopathology identified the material as myocardium, fibers of human heart muscle.
So yeah, being told that you're going to receive, quote, the sacred blood and holy body would have been entirely normal sounding phrases to me as a Catholic child. I heard it all growing up. And so would have these villagers. Whether that is intentional manipulation or genuine belief that was influenced by the religion's proximity to the Catholic Church culture is pretty hard to determine. But for the scope of this video, the point I'm making is it doesn't sound nearly as crazy. I mean, we have the benefit of knowing what the problem is when we're learning about this as well. The villagers didn't have that. They were just normal people who were masterfully being deceived. And clearly not everyone was cool with this. Not everybody wanted a needle to be plunged into their veins. The prequel book brings up an example from the writer's perspective where his brother tried to actively resist. He started shouting, "Brother, help me," as he tried to refuse the so-called ceremony. But too many of the villagers believed it needed to be done for the whole of the community in order for the process to work, just as Lord Sadler preached. And again, them being in crisis, they needed a solution to the madness ASAP. So eventually that man, along with any other resistance, was effectively peer pressured into oblivion to finally accept. And from here, the story takes one of its darkest turns that conveniently, but actually very logically explains why you aren't taking out grotesque, deformed, parasite, hive mind 8-year-olds in the game. This would have been a huge PR nightmare for Capcom that they cleverly avoided in this way. Basically, when it boils down to it, the parasite is way too much for a child's body to support. The villager who wrote the book from his perspective details how his daughter began foaming at the mouth and became overcome by a devastating level of pain until agonizingly dying, as the rest of the villagers' children did as well. This is certainly not the only failed prototype we'd witness in the game. I mean, just look at the regens. There's some pretty terrifying failures. But back to the adult villagers who then transformed into the Illuminados. It was quite clear they had absolutely no idea what they were actually in for. They were taking what they were told was a cure for the madness and were completely lied to. And as their minds were literally taken from them, well, they definitely retained some ability to speak and carry out basic motor functions, but it wasn't their words anymore. It wasn't their actions. I mean, just think about some of the transformations that would happen at night. They literally lost their brains when those happened. They didn't even have a head. As the lead researcher in the notes from the remake listed, she said, quote, "Once fully developed, the parasite gains complete control. In other words, the host becomes a puppet." You see this in third-person perspective with the aforementioned Foreman's notes as well, and even more vividly from a first-person perspective when you're playing as the character Leon, or what about Ashley to the point that Ashley nearly kills Leon. And so fittingly, one of the notes in the remake that's titled Sadler's Animus states, "Who needs spies when you can turn yesterday's enemy into today's ally?" But what about the minions of Lord Sadler and Sadler himself? Well, this part is a bit tougher to answer. For one, it's outright stated in the game that the dominant Plaga strain does not damage the host's intelligence at all. But it would appear it's not that simple. If you look at Sadler's lieutenants, there are huge disparities in their cognitive abilities. Let's start at the bottom with Chief Batoris Mendez. You have to ask yourself, how did Mendez go from being a devout Catholic and protector of the village who was literally burning these people alive when they had the madness, and suddenly about face while transforming himself into absolute devotion personified in service of Los Illuminados? I mean, just listen to what he says during this boss fight.
Abandon your body to the will of our God. Oh, Almighty, grant me the strength to crush your enemies.
He's just relentlessly preaching to Leon the entire time. And the notes he leaves in the game outright says he took the Plagas first only believing it to be a cure for the madness just as his followers did. He even openly questions if he can trust Sadler in doing so. Then suddenly his notes become incredibly devout. There's not even a mention of God as he dies. He doesn't say Gloria las Plagas like some of the followers do. Instead he says, Sadler. For Ramon Salazar, it's a bit more complex because he was actually seduced by Sadler's beliefs as a young man who preyed upon Ramon's hatred of his own family. I mean, in the game, it details how he was mentally abused throughout his life, which made him super vindictive. So he found refuge in the cult and the added bonus of revenge against his family who had suppressed the parasite, and really the entire Sadler family since it was discovered. So by all means, he had a much better idea of what he was in for than Mendez. However, I'm not so convinced that he was fully in control either. Not only was he preaching at Leon during their battle as well, he also did the same as Mendez upon his passing. And what does it matter? Of course they're going to preach while they're fighting. Both of them did because they're followers, right? Well, the reason I think this is because the game shares notes from two key people. Anabel Garcia Escudero, who was the head researcher on this project, which was to develop the dominant strain of the Plaga, and also another of the lead researchers gives us a full picture of the dominant strain's characteristics. And it should definitely be stated that this was all done while these two were imprisoned. These researchers were not members of this cult at all. So that researcher, which is unnamed but is just below Anabel in the project, backs this up as they are about to be administered the dominant Plaga themselves, and specifically mention that this is the dominant strain used on Ashley as well. There is no other dominant Plaga mentioned in the game. This is the one. He goes on to mention that Annabelle is injected first, and immediately she is not herself anymore, and that, quote, the smile has been wiped completely from her face. And by the time we get to Annabelle's notes, she's fully under control and goes into further detail of how she is under control of the dominant Plaga. Annabelle says, quote, Dearest Lord Sadler, I am overjoyed to report wonderful news. Production of the superior species of Las Plagas is officially underway. She then notes, as the other researcher did, that the dominant strain does not damage the host brain, and here is exactly why I'm questioning Mendez and Salazar being in control of their minds. She then goes on to state, no one can oppose the strength of your dominance, my lord. On the contrary, who would resist once they experience the utter joy that accompanies the absence of free will? I am living proof. How ignorant was I? Plain as day, she is telling you, as the lead researcher in the development of the dominant strain that all these bosses are taking, that she took, that she resisted initially, and is now living proof that she doesn't have free will anymore. Which for me explains a ton, especially with the village chief. I mean, his behavior changed towards the cult on a dime. Again, he thought he was getting a cure for the madness. It also explains why their dying breath was focused on Lord Sadler himself, not God, not saying Gloria Las Plagas, but the man controlling their minds. But when you look at the last lieutenant before Sadler, Krauser, well, yeah, he doesn't utter a single word in support of the cult. He is solely focused on attaining power after suffering at the hands of the US government.
Revenge. You think I'm doing all this for revenge? Isn't that what this is all about? See, in that jungle, I had a revelation. The most important thing in this world is pure, unadulterated power.
Even when he mentions the Plaga, it's still in reference to his own power. And I should definitely take this time to point out that so far the remake and the original have diverged quite widely on his motivations. In the original, he's plain as day following Wesker's orders, where in the remake, there's no mention of this at all. Maybe in separate ways when that's finally released, we'll get to see something about that. And to be fair, in the original, it definitely went into more detail there.
Krauser answers directly to Wesker, and it was Wesker who decided that Krauser should be sent to spy on the cult. He also decided to send me along.
But either way, whether he has somehow retained his own agency or he is being fully controlled doesn't really matter. That's because in the original, Sadler explicitly distrusts Krauser, so he already suspects him of being selfish anyway, and for acting out of his own interest. In the remake, that story element has so far been absent, but it's still equally true that he appears to solely be after power, and never even utters the word God a single time. He doesn't even call Lord Sadler Lord Sadler. At this stage, looking into it so much, the only thing I can be left with is that, well, something is different about his strain. He appears to be the singular enemy in the entire game who's been given the plaga that simply is using it as a mere tool.
This has nothing to do with them. I'm a free man who makes a choice.
Doesn't care about the religion, doesn't care about Sadler, it's just a means to an end. Considering he would be the last of the major enemies to presumably receive it, I mean, if you think about it, Ashley's kidnapping happened after everyone else was already turned, so maybe he was rewarded a slightly better strain that had been researched by that time in exchange for managing to steal one of the most guarded people on the planet. I mean, honestly, who knows though, it's just speculation at this point. And finally, before I move on to Sadler, I think the other enemies in the game were also fully under Sadler's control. The Verdugo both chose their path following Salazar, but never acted in their own interest and were just intensely obedient. If it wasn't mind control, it's virtually impossible to tell. From there, with the Regeneradors, the Iron Maidens, Novistadors, El Gigantes, etc., all the other enemies, there's no real sign of free will or personal motivation exhibited in any of them. So then, moving on to Sadler himself, it's pretty unclear exactly when he was infected with the dominant form of the Plagas, because access to the fossilized Las Plagas was strictly forbidden for centuries. He was the one responsible for uncovering it, but obviously at some point he convinced Ramon Salazar to give him access, and furthermore it's obvious that through his family history and active scheming meant he very much wanted to take the Plaga willingly. What's also clear is that Sadler predictably had the most dominant strain of anyone else. As Luis's research noted, he did eventually find a strain of the most dominant species only seen in Sadler himself that might be even more powerful than what he'd already seen in Sadler's system. But whether Sadler had him figured out or not, he did manage to confiscate the amber holding this strain and presumably took it to become even more powerful. I'm not sure if this was what was supposed to go to Wesker or if this was just a different vial. Who knows, it could have been either. But what's really hard for me to determine in reading everything and going into the lore is, well, how much control did Sadler have over himself? Was he just a puppet as well? I mean, it's called a parasite. What makes a parasite parasitic in the first place is that they are by nature mooching off their host. Does the famed cordyceps virus have any positives for an ant? I mean, definitely not. The game also mentions other viruses that also do similar things, and it's pretty much all the same story. In real life, insects get infected with these spores or fungi to do just one thing. They'll take themselves to an area to get purposefully eaten by birds, who then shit out these spores and then spread them to more hosts. The insect never ever wins in those equations. And I guess you could say Sadler and, of course, Krauser, they do gain power. I mean, that's what Krauser is after, at least. Did this just amp it up? We don't really know. There's such a big gap between the Javier mission and this game. But there's definitely the other side of this as well, the more obvious part. For centuries, Sadler and his family, along with their original followers, weren't allowed anywhere near the Amber. They were exiled to that island and were the ones that created all of this imagery and worshipped it. Once Sadler got some power, sure, there was plenty of cash to capture new recruits and force them into the cult, but that original core group certainly developed this doctrine over the centuries and told tales of what it was like before the Salazars buried the Amber underneath their castle and kicked the Sadlers out. And yeah, considering Sadler at least appeared to be sincerely devout until the very end, assuming those were his actions and not merely the superior plagas to try to spread spread itself, it could be definitely argued that he really did worship the Plaga all along with those originally exiled followers. It really helps that they worshipped it before being infected. But without a doubt, the one single person by the end of it who is getting anything out of all that was Lord Sadler himself. I mean, we're talking total and complete world domination. There's a reason Wesker was after this. I mean, just think about everybody else. Krauser was kidnapping people for him and fighting his battles. So was Salazar, the Verdugo, the poor village chief, and his unwitting followers, along with the other cultists, who all fell under his control. Either way, I think we can put the Los Illuminados into two distinctly separate groups. Sadler and his original followers with their lineage that believed this without even having the Plagas around, who clearly believed it all on a doctrinal level out of their own free will. And then group number 2, who is basically everyone else, they were all clearly manipulated or brought in entirely through brute force. Or more simply, we can just call this the choice group versus the coerced group. And then Krauser is just Krauser. Whatever the hell's going on with him, I have no idea. So then, do either or both of these groups fit into any of the more accepted religious definitions? Well, for this part, I've got to admit I'm no PhD on the subject, no matter how much I enjoy talking about it, and will need to defer to some experts on this one. And if you're unaware, there's a fantastic channel called Religion for Breakfast that does a really great job exploring the world's major religions from an academic perspective. Well, he, as well as just about anyone else who's tried to ask themselves this question in a critical manner, would immediately tell you that there is no one solid definition. In his video simply titled, "What is Religion?" he explores this through the lens of several scholars and their attempts to do just that. One of the more basic definitions is with E.B. Tyler, who simply defined it as
belief in supernatural beings.
While pretty much everyone these days in the field would call this far too simplistic an answer, we'll at least give it a shot to explore this video. So how did the choice and coerced groups from RE4 match to this? Well, if you ask me, genuine belief can only be attributed to the first group. So if it's a belief in supernatural things, that's a pass-fail. But what about some of the more complex ideas? One idea is that it's down to a checklist. You can't really define it in one simple sentence. Roger Audi is probably one of the better examples on this front. So what he says is belief in the supernatural, distinct between sacred and profane, ritual acts focused on sacred/profane objects, a moral code believed to be sanctioned by divine beings, feelings of awe and direct communication, a worldview concerning the role of humanity in the universe, and a collective organization bound up in this worldview. Yeah, that's a lot. But I think we can safely say the choice group for the Los Illuminados again passes. I mean, they worship the Plaga and believe it's supernatural for sure. Plenty of grotesque rituals, even before the Plagas were given to them by the original cultists. And they definitely had direct communication considering they became the hosts. The only one I have a question about is the moral thing. I mean, they definitely believe infecting others in this way, however violent it is, kind of the point. So that's not really immoral in their worldview, but I'm not seeing much in the game that defines morals or immorals. But it doesn't matter because it passes pretty much all the rest. And for these checklists to work, it's not 100% pass-fail type kind of thing. It's just a majority that you need to have. And then for the coerced group, well, how can you have a worldview that you don't have the ability to cognitively exercise? Can you even feel awe if that's not you feeling it? Is it even their brain anymore? Sure, they might pass these superficially if you don't realize that they are being controlled, but that's the whole issue with it. None of these people are willingly doing any of these things. Not in the coerced group. They literally can't think on their own. There are a few others mentioned in this video, but I think it's pretty much the same test on repeat. The only statement from a scholar that offered anything different is from Jonathan Z. Smith, who basically just says, well, you can't define religion. That doesn't work for the purposes of this video. Anyhow, I think that pretty much answers it. Is the Los Illuminados a true religion? Yes and no. Anyhow, I'm probably wrong about all this. It's just a super fun argument to make, and it's a really fun deep dive for me. I enjoy talking about this type of subject matter, and I really enjoy talking about Resident Evil 4. It's just really fun. But yeah, screwing on point. Glad to be back. If you did like this, please consider liking and subscribing. If you want this channel to stick around and you like this kind of content, that kind of support is by far the quickest way to ensure we stick around on this channel. I mean, it's a lot of work and it takes up a lot of time, so if no one's watching. We don't have anything here. Plus, we got a ton more content coming your way soon, so definitely stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next video. Peace.